So, very good morning to all of you, and welcome to the eighth and the last class on tradition and individual talent. In the last class, we ended with the discussion on how T.S. Eliot actually criticized and later negated the romantic subjectivism, and as well as also challenged uh, Wordsworth's idea on the nature and function of poetry. Now, T.S. Eliot says that uh, Eliot actually rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry and points out that in the process of poetic composition, there is neither emotion nor recollection nor tranquility. He says there should not be recollection, emotion, or tranquility, but what is required that is that there will be only concentration of a number of experiences, a concentration on number of experiences, and a number of experiences, and this actually, this new thing results from and the new thing actually comes out. It's a result of this process of concentration, and this process of concentration, Eliot says, is neither conscious nor deliberate. We ended there that this concentration should not be conscious or deliberate. It should be a passive concentration. There, Eliot says, there may be some elements in the poetic process which may be conscious or deliberate, but the thing is, generally, and in most of the cases, this poetic process of on concentration, and concentration should not be conscious and deliberate. Then he goes on to say, these experiences are not recollected. He says that this is not a recollection. Poetry is not a recollection of experiences, and they finally unite in an atmosphere which is tranquil. And they finally unite in an atmosphere which is tranquil only in that it is a passive attending upon the event. So he says that it is only tranquil, this whole process, that will be tranquility when this process of concentration will be what? That will be passive. There will be a passive participation of the poet. This there, and it should not be deliberate. These experiences, he said, of course, this is not quite the whole story. So Eliot is telling that I'm not going to tell you the final words on this. There may be exceptions. He says that this is not quite the whole story. There is a great deal in the writing of poetry. He says that there is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. He says that generally this process should not be conscious or deliberate, but there will be cases where we will find exceptions and where we will see that this process may be conscious or deliberate. He says that in fact the bad poet is, then he goes on to differentiate between the bad poet and the good poet, and he says that the bad poet always chooses the wrong thing. He is conscious where he should remain unconscious, and he remains unconscious where he should be conscious. So this is how Eliot actually differentiates between the good poet and the bad poet. He says that in fact the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, he says, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. So a bad poet always makes the wrong choice, but errors tend to make him personal. That the bad poet is always erroneous in choosing the personal things and translating that, transmuting that into poetry. So he always makes the wrong choice. Poetry, he says, then he tries to give at least a rough definition of poetry, and he says poetry is not a turning lose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. He says that it is not just turning loose of emotion, it is not just dispensing your emotion, but it should be an escape from emotion. You should know how to restrain your emotion. He says that it is not just turning loose of emotion, but it should be an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Please underline or please mark these lines, and these lines are very important. He says that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion, and it is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So a good poet should know what to express and from what to escape. So a good poet is different from a bad poet in choosing the things where he should remain conscious and where he should not remain conscious, what to express and what not to express. But of course, he says, but of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Now Eliot gives his most witty remark that it is don't come to the conclusion that a poet should not have emotion or a poet lacks the personality. He says that this is the fact that one who actually owns a personality and one who has emotion in him or her, they only can know what emotion to express and how to escape from emotion. If you have emotion, only then you can control your emotion. If you don't have emotion, if you lack emotion, then what will you control? So don't come to the conclusion like that. For writing poetry, you don't need emotion or something. You don't need any personal feeling or experiences. It is not like that. But he wants to make it a point that you should have emotion. There should be emotion in you. You should have your personal feelings and experiences, and you should have the sense what to express and what not to express. A poet should also be a good editor, what to give and what not to give. Then, so here he says that the difference between the good and the bad poet is that a bad poet is conscious where he should not be conscious, and vice versa. It is this consciousness of the wrong kind, he says that this consciousness of the wrong kind, which makes a poem personal, whereas mature art must be impersonal. So this wrong consciousness, that wrong choices that if a bad poet makes, that makes a bad poetry, and bad poetry is most of the time personal poetry. He says that a good poetry should be impersonal. But Eliot does not say the last word on this, because he says that when a poet should be conscious and when not, this is required. So this is a very important quality that a poet should have. But Eliot does not tell us when a poet should be conscious and when not. But the problem is Eliot is here not clearly expressing the thing, and he says that a good poet knows when he should be conscious and about what he should be conscious, and when and about what he should not be conscious. He tells this, but he never clearly explains what a poet should not express, except from vaguely telling that it is just a poet should not express his personality. But he never says when a poet should be conscious about what to express and when he should be unconscious. He never clears that. It has been left vague in the essay. So the final thing is what Eliot wants to establish here is that poetry is an escape from personality and personal emotions. So this is what, again, I'm repeating the definition that Eliot wants to give, that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So then let's go on to the move on to the that is the sorry that is the third part of the essay. And here we find that there is something written in Greek, and these lines are from on the soul. These lines are from all this. I'm sorry, I don't know Greek. And so these lines are from all on the soul by Aristotle. And the meaning of the line, the English rendering is like this. Please note it down. Presumably, the mind is something more divine and is unaffected. So the line goes like this. Presumably, the mind is something more divine and is unaffected. Should I repeat? Presumably, the mind is something more divine and is unaffected. Put comma after divine. Okay, so this is from On the Soul by Aristotle. Now Eliot actually sums up the essay. This essay proposes to halt at the frontier of metaphysics. So he says that this essay actually wants to stand just in front of metaphysics, but it does not intend to enter into the deep alleys of metaphysics, halt at the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism, and confine itself to such practical conclusions as can be applied by the responsible person interested in poetry. He says that in this essay, I just wanted to make it clear that poetry is not always mystic and it only deals with metaphysics, or it only deals with personal reasons or some philosophical abstractions. For poetry, the poet should be very much objective and scientific in his activities. So he should be very clear about what he is expressing, how he is expressing, when he is expressing, and what he is expressing. So there should be a very objective idea about what the poet or what he or she is doing. So he says that this essay actually does what? This essay actually stands just at the frontier of metaphysics and mysticism. It does not want to establish poetry into the very heart of metaphysics and mysticism, but it wants to establish the fact that poetry also deals with the very conscious as well as the unconscious objectiveness of the poet, and the sense of the poet is very much required about what he should express and what not. And the most important thing is, it is always, not always, but most of the time, in most of the cases, it is just an escape from personality and personal emotions. To divert interest from the poet to the poetry is a laudable aim. So he says that actually Eliot is paving the way for new criticism, that the text is more important than the biographical or the emotional details and gestures of the poet or the writer. He says that my intention is to focus on the work itself, the poetry itself, and not the poet. Is a laudable aim, for it would conduce a juster estimation of actual poetry, good and bad. So he says that my intention is to show that focus should be made on the work and not the artist, because we are to judge and we are to find out whether the work is good or bad, not the personal, not the biographical or the emotional registers of the poet. There are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in verse. So many people like this, they always appreciate the sincere emotion in verse, and there is a smaller number of people who can appreciate technical excellence. So a very few number of people can understand the very technicalities of poetry and the and artwork. But very few know when there is an expression of significant emotion. So some people know that this is an expression of emotion, this is sincere expression of emotion, but they fail to objectively analyze the very emotion that the poet wants to express or wants to share with the readers. He fails. So he says that some people, they only just worship the sincere emotion, and very few people know about the technicalities of poetry. But he says that very few know where there is an expression of significant emotion. that which emotion has been made significant in the work. Emotion which has its life in the poem and not in the history of the poet. So what I said, that the emotion that is there in the biographical details of the poet, that is not important. The emotion which is there in the very work, and where there is a distance between the emotion that has been expressed in the work of art, in the poetry, and between the poet, that particular emotion should be focused upon. That particular emotion is significant. That should be studied, analyzed, and appreciated. He says that the emotion of art is impersonal. Underline it. The emotion of art is impersonal. And the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. So he says that the poet should surrender himself to the work. Otherwise, he or she cannot be impersonal. If you cannot negate yourself, this is and here Eliot gives the very basic idea of negative capability while he was analyzing the works of Keats. So negative capability. So he says that the poet should negate his personality. The poet should just give more importance on the emotion and expression that he wants to express in his work, and where we will find that there is a distance, a difference between that emotion and the personality of the poet. And to be impersonal, the poet Eliot says that the poet should know how to negate his personality, negate his personal emotions without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. And he is not likely to know what is to be done unless he lives in what is not merely the present. So he says that, and he is not likely to know, that he will be unaware of what is to be done, that what he should do, he won't have any idea when, unless he lives in what is more merely the present, but the present moment of the past. He says, and for this negation of capability, and for impersonally entering into the poem and building a poem, what you need is not just negating your personal emotions and experiences, but at the same time, the poet should be also aware of the presentness of the past, of the historical sense is what that the poet requires. He should not live in the present only, but he should know how to live in the presentness of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but of what is already living. That he should know that the past is not dead, but the past is something which is still living with the present. The poet should have the sense of the presentness of the past. So, therefore, Eliot, we can say, that does not deny personality or emotion to the poet. Emotion only he says that the poet should depersonalize his emotions. There should be, he says, there should be an extinction of his personality. The poet should know how to make his personality extinct. This impersonality, he says, can be achieved only when the poet surrenders himself completely to the work that is to be done. That the poet should give more importance to the work itself and try to give less importance to his biographical details and his personal feelings and emotions. And the poet can know what, he says, that the poet can only know what is to be done when, only if he acquires a sense of tradition. So sense of tradition means that the historical sense, the sense of history, the awareness about the presentness of the past, that the past is still living with the present. He says that only he can have this consciousness when he is successful in acquiring a sense of tradition, the historic sense, which makes him conscious. So what actually the sense of history makes? It makes him conscious not only of the present, but also of the present moment of the past, not only of what is dead. The poet becomes aware of what is already living. The poet will never come to the conclusion that the past is something which is dead. It is something which is a closed chapter. It is not like that. The past is still living with the present. And only then, when the poet will be able to understand this, only then he will acquire a sense of history, and he will have an idea of tradition. With the sense of tradition and the power of negating his or her personal emotions, the poet becomes conscious of what to express and what not to express, what to restrain and what not to restrain. And only then the poet becomes a good poet and contributes something significant and worthful in the history, in the tradition of creation, in the tradition of art. Okay, thank you. So here ends our discussion on tradition and individual talent. Thank you, all of you.